This picture reflects the hardship of war. Levi Parsons Thompson was a captain and quartermaster in the 16th Massachusetts Regiment. That regiment left Cambridge for Fort Monroe, Virginia, on August 17, 1861. His wife Mary died of phthisis at Cambridge on November 5, 1816. That was less than 3 months after he left for the war. Mary was 25. The young child in the picture was their only child, Louise Thompson Boyd. She died in 1945. Louise was raised in Cambridge by her grandparents John and Sarah Stiles. Levi died at Newberry, North Carolina from break fever on September 20, 1862. Louise and her husband Charles Boyd were music directors and had 5 children. They all rest together with Mary and Levi. Dorothea Lynn Dix. Much of this narrative was taken from the following. Meredith Mitchell's 2011 article, published by the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority, Biography.com, and Barbara N. Caldwell's Dorothea Lynn Dix, Privilege, Passion, and Reform, and womenhistoryblog.com. Dorothea Dix was born on April 4, 1802, in Hampton, Maine. She died on July 17, 1887, at the State Asylum in Trenton, New Jersey. Dorothea had founded that asylum. In 1848, she opened the first state hospital for the mentally ill there. 5 years before she died, the state provided her with a home there. Eventually, she opened 32 such hospitals in 12 states for the mentally ill. Her father, Joseph, was a traveling preacher. He was an alcoholic, religious fanatic, and distributor of religious tracts. He died in Boston in 1821 from intemperance. Her mother had poor mental health. In 1814, Madame Dorothy Dix, Dorothea's 70-year-old paternal grandmother, decided that her son and his wife were no longer capable of caring for their children. Madame Dix took the 3 children, including Dorothea, to live at the Dix Mansion in Boston. Dorothea's parents went off to live with relatives. Madame Dix raised Dorothea in the Congregational Church. After attending Reverend William Ellery Channing's service, she became a Unitarian. Her grandfather, Elijah Dix, was an influential importer of tea and pharmaceutical products, chemicals, and appliances. He created the family fortune. As an entrepreneur, he developed local merchant institutions and diversified his investments. The Dix family mansion, built on Orange Street in Boston with its tailored botanical gardens, bespoke of the standards of the aristocratic community. He also transformed State Street into a city enterprise and erected chemical factories in South Boston. In 1800, her father married Mary Bigelow, who, according to his father, Elijah Dix, was a step backward for the family's reputation. As Elijah Dix's prestige grew, he invested in real estate, purchasing vast acreage in western Maine and developing a commercial center known as Dixmont, Maine. Because Joseph failed to graduate from Harvard to make a place for himself in Boston, his father provided the couple with land in Hampton, Maine. Like her mother, Dorothea suffered from depression. At the age of 12, she went to Worcester, Massachusetts, to live with an aunt. When she was 14, she taught girls her own curriculum in natural science and ethics. Dorothy wrote several books and articles, including the textbook, Conversations on Common Things, in 1824. It can be downloaded from Google Book without cost. In 1836, she traveled to Europe, needing a rest after attending to Madame Dix's illness. Dorothea was also afflicted with tuberculosis. While in Europe, she became interested in prison and mental illness reform. In 1838, Dorothea returned to Boston. In 1841, she began to teach women at the Cambridge jail. She also ensured that the insane inmates were separated from the criminals. Networking experiences caused her to begin a crusade for prison and mental hospital reform. She toured the United States. In 1845, she published her remark on prison discipline in the United States. In 1861, 1 week after the Civil War began, she volunteered to help. President Lincoln appointed her superintendent of Union female nurses. Although her health was sometimes poor, she never missed a day from her duties. She served without monetary compensation. Among her requirements for nurses was that they be plain-looking, over 30, and wear black or brown skirts. Bows, curls, jewelry, and hoop skirts were forbidden. Dorothea recruited 3,000 nurses. Some called her Dragon Dix for her perceived dictatorial leadership style. To me, she was controversial and often an unpopular figure. When wounded soldiers began pouring into the hospitals in Washington, she was shocked by the War Department's lack of preparation. Because of the shortage of ambulances, Miss Dix purchased one with her own money and sent it to the battlefield to rescue the wounded soldiers still there. Obviously, more hospitals were necessary. The immediate solution was to commandeer private homes in Washington, including the Hollowell House on Washington Street, the Tibbs House, the Fowle and Johnson Homes on Prince Street, and the Grosvenor House in Washington. Those were in addition to churches and a theological school. Miss Dix made it a point to all of those locations. As the need for more nurses arose, she relaxed her restrictions on recruits in favor of taking women who were trained nurses, or just willing to help. Experiencing 4 long years of death and destruction, she wrote to a friend that "This war is breaking my heart." Women nurses were employed at the rate of 1 to every 2 soldiers. They received 40 cents a day, rations, living quarters, and transportation. Those guidelines were altered later in the war, reducing the wage and increasing the ratio to 1 nurse to every 10 beds, a number later raised to 30. Women nurses were limited to serving at base hospitals unless they were needed for an emergency elsewhere. Dorothea traveled to many military hospitals away from the East Coast to help organize and conduct inspections. When the St. Louis hospitals were struggling severely, she helped to raise $700,000 for nurses and supplies by appealing to other Union states for financial help. Not everyone appreciated her efforts, however. Many surgeons, and citizens alike, resented her authority to inspect their hospitals. Although she eventually lost the authority as the sole hiring agent, she continued her volunteer position until the war ended in 1865, and 18 months thereafter. There are 2 revealing descriptions of her work during that time. Historian Benson John Lawson described her. Like an angel of mercy, she labored day and night for the relief of suffering soldiers. She went from battlefield to battlefield when the carnage was over, and from camp to camp, giving with her own hands efforts to the wounded and soothing the troubled spirits of the dying. The amount of happiness that resulted from the services of this woman can never be estimated. Her friend Dr. Caroline Burkhart said, "She was a very retiring, sensitive woman, yet brave and bold as a lion to do battle for the right and for justice. She was very unpopular in the war with surgeons, nurses, and any others who failed to do their whole duty, and they disliked seeing her appear, as she was sure to do if needed. She was one who found no time to make herself famous with pen and paper, but a hard, earnest worker, living in the most simple manner, often having to be reminded that she needed food. Every day recalls some of her noble acts of kindness and self-sacrifice to mind. She seemed to me to lead a dual life, one for the outside world, the other for her trusted, tried friends." Civil War Medicine, Corinne Cox Miglio, Savannah Dyer, Olivia George, Ariana Montemayor. The writings of nurses who served under her run the gamut of opinions. 8 other nurses are presented in this presentation. Emily Parsons, Mary Finney von Olnhausen, and Hannah Stevenson mention Miss Dix. Their following segments will describe the hardships and self-sacrifice they endured caring for the wounded, several at significant risk to their health. Dorothea Dix undertook a position that had never existed. There were no guidelines for her to accomplish the Herculean job. We shall hear the difficulties that she had with some of her nurses, as well as various male doctors and certain officers with whom she had contact. She had the full backing of President Lincoln. She was not influenced by critics who used political routes to impede her management. Emily Elizabeth Parsons. Emily was the daughter of Professor Theophilus Parsons of the Harvard Law School. She was described as indomitable, heroic, and warm-hearted. At the beginning of the Civil War, she trained to be a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. Her intent was to go to the war and care for and wounded Union soldiers. She began her nursing studies having, as a younger person, incurred 3 major health injuries. She had impaired vision from an injury. At age 5, she accidentally ran a pointed pair of scissors into her right eye, causing blindness. Her left eye strained to compensate, so she never had a normal vision after that. At age 7, Emily contracted scarlet fever. Initially, it left her totally deaf. She slowly recovered to partial hearing. That allowed her to understand when someone looked at her directly and talked to her. At age 25, she severely injured her ankle, causing almost constant pain. After long hours of standing and walking, she was obliged to sit for some time to recover. Emily did enter the nurses program at Massachusetts General Hospital. After 18 months of training, the hospital gave her a 2-year furlough to begin ministering to wounded soldiers. In October 1862, she was given a ward and attended to 50 wounded soldiers at Fort Schuyler Military Hospital on Long Island, New York. Later, Emily wrote to Dorothea Dix, offering her services wherever they might be needed. She was sent to St. Louis. The sick and wounded were brought from Vicksburg, Arkansas Post, and Helena up the river. They were cared for at St. Louis and other military posts. Later, Emily was made head nurse of the hospital steamer, the City of Alton. That was during the Vicksburg, Mississippi campaign. At Vicksburg, the ship was loaded with 400 invalid soldiers sick with fever, and others past recovery. They returned as far as Memphis. During this trip, Emily's strength and endurance were tried, having given her utmost in caring for the helpless and suffering men. Emily performed such duties for many more months. After serving 6 months in the capacity, having several recurrences of malaria, Emily went back home to Massachusetts. After a short rest, she went back to St. Louis and resumed his same position at the Benton Barracks Hospital. She stayed there until August 1864, when poor health caused her to go home again. By the time she recovered, the war was over. She then spent her time aiding the freed slaves and refugees by collecting clothing and other necessary items. At home, in Cambridge, Emily attempted to address the town's lack of adequate health care for its citizens by raising money to establish a small charity hospital for women and children. That opened in 1867, at Cambridgeport. She served as the matron and nurse. However, after a year, the hospital was forced to close. In December 1869, Emily opened a new hospital in East Cambridge, at the corners of Prospect and Hampshire Streets. That hospital closed after 2 years. When Emily died from a stroke, on May 19, 1880, her father published her correspondence entitled, Memoir of Emily Elizabeth Parsons. That free 159-page book can be downloaded from Google Books. Emily's hospital fundraising efforts continued in her memory. In 1883, there were sufficient to purchase a 9-acre plot overlooking the Charles River near Jerry's Landing. The building of Mount Auburn Hospital began. The first structure, completed in 1886, was named the Parsons Building in Emily's honor. Hannah Elizabeth Stevenson. She was an activist and well-known Boston abolitionist. In August 1861, she was the first Massachusetts woman to volunteer to serve as a Civil War nurse. Hannah already had a lifetime of service experience behind her. In the years before she joined the war effort, she had worked for 30 years at the Home for Destitute Children. Hannah was 53 years old when she volunteered to serve as a nurse. She would serve at multiple Union hospitals between 1861 and 1863. During the early months of the Civil War, she wrote to her family about her work as a nurse at Columbia Hospital in Washington. Hannah lamented the hazards many of the soldiers encountered in the hospitals, including disease, mistreatment by superiors, hunger, and homesickness, all the while celebrating the soldiers' dedication to the Union cause and the endless work of her fellow nurses whose muscles never surrender to the demands of the work. Like most of the more than 20,000 women who served as nurses during the war, Hannah had no formal medical training. As she illustrated in a letter, her male counterparts were often no better qualified, as the male nurses were usually convalescent soldiers unable to return to their regiments. Hannah's letters highlighted the difficult relationship male military surgeons and female nurses. Many male surgeons resented the presence of civilian women in military hospitals. In June 1861, the federal government named Boston's Dorothea Dix superintendent of female nurses in hopes that Miss Dix, as Hannah refers to her, could ease tensions between nurses and the hospital surgeons. She could not. Many of her letters were critical of Dorothea Dix's abilities as a manager. Hannah's letters also illustrated the awkwardness of serving under the medical staff. One letter stated, "I cannot get over the surprise of being ordered about by these surgeons as they order the privates. They recognize nothing of the peculiarity of the position." According to family legend, Hannah was well known for composing impressive love letters on behalf of young soldiers. An observer recalled, "All who could limp up to hear the reading, applauding it with merry shouts of laughter, and only wished Miss Stevenson would write their love letters for them. She said it all so much better than they could." At the close of the war in 1865, Hannah traveled to Richmond on behalf of the Freedmen's Bureau, helping to establish schools for former slaves. Her work assisted this new government agency in enrolling 90,000 former slaves in public schools by the end of the year. Civil War nurse Louise Alcott dedicated her memoir, Hospital Sketches, to her, as she was her mentor. That free 106-page book can be downloaded from Google Books. The Boston Globe, July 15, 1887, page 1 noted her passing. Miss Hannah Stevenson of Boston, who died last week, was especially noticeable for her charities among the colored people of the Hub. She was a warm friend and a liberal patron of the Boston Home of Aged Colored Women. She bore the name of an abolitionist when it cost so much to be one. Gentle, mild, yet outspoken and positive in her denunciation of wrong, she was a small but noble band of Christian women who, in the early days, warmly championed the cause of the slave. Anna Cabot Lowell Woodbury was the niece of poet James Russell Lowell, sister of Lieutenant James Jackson Lowell and Brigadier General Charles Russell Lowell. In the early summer of 1862, having recently been trained as an Army nurse, Anna was assigned to the hospital ship Daniel Webster on the James River. When she arrived at Harrison's Landing, Virginia in June 1862, she continued her work despite news that her brother James had been killed in the 7 Days battles during the Peninsula Campaign. James Jackson Lowell was mortally wounded at Glendale on June 30, 1862. He was interred near the battlefield. After the war, Anna brought his body home for burial in the Lowell family plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery. In September 1862, she traveled south to Washington, D.C., where she first served as a nurse at the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown, D.C. She arrived at Armory Square in October 1862 and served there until August 1865. Nurses assigned to Armory Square Hospital worked under Army regulations, and Dorothea Dix, superintendent of Union Army nurses, was in charge of Armory Square. Dix was a strong-willed person who often ignored orders, and her perseverance gave her the nickname Dragon Dix. Anna's brother Charles Russell Lowell was mortally wounded at the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864. 2 days later, Anna went to the office of Secretary of State Edwin M. Stanton, searching for news about her brother. There she learned of Charles's death directly from his fellow officer General George Armstrong. Charles's wife was Josephine Shaw Lowell, philanthropist, and sister of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, commander of the 54th Massachusetts, U.S. Colored Troops, who lost his life at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina on July 18, 1863. Armory Square Hospital badly needed the services of Anna Lowell, therefore, she did not attend her brother's funeral in Cambridge with the rest of her family. Charles's death was announced in the hospital newspaper, the Armory Square Hospital Gazette. Anna remained in the overwhelmed Armory Square hospital wards while the rest of her family mourned in Cambridge. Anna Lowell Woodbury was one of many who were instrumental in challenging many of Dorothea Dix's rules that inhibited certain women from joining her group. It must have been difficult for Dorothea to be in charge of so many people of influence and with access to powerful people, including senators and the president. One of the most substantial critiques of regulations was that she discounted capable and socially acceptable young women from serving as nurses solely on account of their age and appearance. Early in the war, 28-year-old Anna Lowell of Boston, Massachusetts traveled to Washington determined to serve as a nurse. Despite being highly recommended by Dr. Jackson, a physician in Massachusetts and Lowell's uncle, Dix rejected Lowell's application, sending her back to Boston. Recalling the event, Lowell later wrote, "Her only objection seemed to be that I was too young." Despite being denied by Dix, Lowell went on to serve briefly as a nurse aboard Sanitary Commission hospital ships. From 1862 to 1865, Lowell also served as nurse at the Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C. She received and succeeded in both positions without the support of Dix. Dix was unaware, however, that Abby Gibbons had asked Sarah Lowe and Anna Lowell, two nurses employed independently of Dix Army Square Hospital, to join them. About a week after Dix had left them at Point Lookout, Scotland, Maryland, her own nurses arrived back on her doorstep. Surgeon Wagner had assured her that her nurses were working out splendidly at Point Lookout, but Dix was caught off guard when Abby Gibbons appointed herself matron of the hospital, dismissed Dix's nurses, and appointed her own in their place. Witnessing Gibbons' seizure of authority, Nurse Sophronia Buckland at Point Lookout observed that Gibbons' strong Quaker sense of personal independence, and her masculine contempt for all women not endowed with her energetic, unyielding will, rendered it exceedingly distasteful to recognize any superiority in the chosen superintendent of women nurses. Confronted with this blatant disregard for her authority, Dix visited Surgeon General Hammond, demanding to know who had given Mrs. Gibbons the authority to discharge her nurses. Despite having met with Mrs. Gibbons, Hammond claimed that the authority did not derive from him. In fact, it appears that Hammond had been unsure about allowing Gibbons to travel to Point Lookout in the first place. "I don't know how they'll receive you. I don't know anything about it," Hammond is reputed to have told Gibbons. An inquiry into the situation determined that inefficiencies had allowed Gibbons to gain control over the nursing staff. Similar measures were taken to obtain a position for Anna Lowell at Armory Square. Denied a nursing position by Dix earlier in the war, Lowell, from Boston, wrote to Hannah Stevenson in 1862, asking for assistance. Citing a previous encounter with Dix, who turned her away because she was too young, Lowell wanted to be entirely under Dr. Bliss and have nothing to do with Miss Dix. "From what I have heard of her," Lowell reasoned, "I should think that after having one refused a person, she would be likely to remain always rather set against her, would she not?" Lowe spoke with Bliss, who agreed that Lowell could come work at his hospital. Social connection essential to this process. In 1863, Lowe received a similar request from a Miss M. Wheelock, also from Massachusetts, but this time Lowe refused to help, stating, "I could not give her any satisfactory information, as she wishes her expenses paid and I do not know much about her." Bliss' demand for control over the nursing staff did not go unnoticed by Dix. When she heard of Lowell's potential appointment, Dix was infuriated that she, the proper official authority, had been disregarded. Despite her fury, Bliss continued to appoint his own nurses, although he still relied on her to staff the hospital in emergency situations. Still, Dix was dissatisfied. She told Hannah Ropes that it was very strange of Dr. Bliss making such a change in his nurses. Since Lowe and Lowell were the first two nurses hired directly by Bliss, and neither of them met her age requirements, Dix saw them as an immediate threat to her authority within the hospital. In a conversation with another nurse, Dix is reported to have said of Lowe, "No doubt her intentions are good, but she is a most unsuitable person." Attempting to regain control of the nursing staff, Dix directly challenged Bliss' administrative authority within his own hospital. She sent the Inspector General to examine the female nurses at Armory Square Hospital, nurses only receiving 10 minutes notice. Recalling the event, Lowe wrote, "They turned over beds to see if there was anything under them and looked into everything." The inspector, observing that Lowe was not one of Dix's nurses, specifically questioned her about her medicine chest. He seemed pleased with the order. Lowe reported home. The nurses later discovered that Dix reported all except the 4 nurses she had appointed for neglect of duty. It was whispered that Dix was determined to get rid of Miss Lowell and Lowe, if she could. A concerned Lowe worried that, it is said she has a great deal of influence with the president. Ultimately, no neglect was found, and the women maintained their positions. The power struggle, though, shows how Dix desperately attempted to maintain her administrative authority in the face of open opposition. Miss Lowell has no surgeon in her ward, she has to depend upon one from another ward. Lowe added that Lowell lacked an experienced wound dresser. In this case, the lack of experienced staff placed an added burden of responsibility on the nurses. Nurses Anna Lowell and Mary Felton left the hospital and spoke with Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, imploring him to speak with President Abraham Lincoln. They asked that Dr. Bliss to return to the Armory Square Hospital prior to his scheduled trial, arguing that the lives of the patients were at stake. Dr. Bliss was then allowed to return to the Army Square Hospital. In her memoir, Mary Finney von Olnhausen reflected on the impact of inexperienced physicians. I know now that many a life could have been saved had been a competent surgeon in the ward. Inexperience led to botched surgical procedures as well as inefficiencies in hospital administration. Caitlin Ruth Vance, University of New Hampshire, Durham. Mary Finney von Olnhausen. Preface. If you heard this name recently, it stemmed from PBS's series, Mercy Street. I located and read her diary in 2012, long before PBS's 2016 series. I gave several lectures that noted her diary. Perhaps one then read the book and brought her story to the public. If you saw the series and read her diary, the contrast between facts to fiction is shocking. Much of the following, in italics, was taken from Mary Finney von Olnhausen's diary. After Mary's death, her nephew, James Finney Monroe, published the diary. Years of an Army Nurse in Two Wars, Little Brown Company, 1903. Mary died, from paralysis, in Lexington, Massachusetts, on April 12, 1902. Her grandfather was Dr. Josiah Bartlett from Charlestown. At age 16, he was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Surgeon's mate to Dr. John Warren. Josiah was later made a full surgeon and served through the rest of the war. In 1849, upon the death of her father, the Lexington farm was sold. Those daughters who were not married were left to their own resources. Mary went to Manchester, New Hampshire, and became a designer of goods. That was a new career for women. On May 1, 1858, she married Baron Gustav A. von Olnhausen. Gustav was 49. Mary was 39. Reverend Theodore Parker, transcendentalist, abolitionist, and member of the Secret Six, performed the wedding. The Secret Six. That a group of men secretly funded the 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry by abolitionist John Brown. Their marriage record notes that it was the first marriage for each. Baron von Olnhausen left Saxony after 1848 due to unrest and financial troubles, led to the selling of his castle. When they met, he was making a meager living as a chemist at a dye house in the Manchester Mills, located in New Hampshire. He died September 13, 1860, of kidney disease and is buried with Mary. 2 months after her husband's death, Mary moved to Illinois to assist her family, 4 children and an invalid wife. He was a farmer, and his land was besieged with misery. Upon learning about the Battle of Bull Run, Mary decided to enter the war as a nurse. When she arrived in Boston, she immediately appealed to Dorothea Dix. Mary was promised to be placed at once. The delay was so long that Mary began to doubt her. However, she was summoned to Washington. She received the news in August of 1862. It was on a Saturday, and she left Monday. Mary was assigned to the Mansion House Hospital, the city's largest military hospital. In Mary's own words, Miss Dix, who had been appointed by the President head of the Army nurses, took me from Washington to Alexandria to the Mansion House Hospital. She told me on the journey that the surgeon in charge was determined to give her no foothold in any hospital where he reigned, and that I was to take no notice of anything that might occur and was to make no complaint whatever might happen. She was a stern woman of few words. There seemed to be much confusion about the Mansion House, which before the war was a famous hotel and every part of it was crowded. She left me in the office and went in search of Dr. S. The sight of the wounded continuously carried through on stretchers or led in as they arrived from the boats that lay at the foot of the street a hospital stood. This was just after that awful Cedar Mountain battle on August 9th. It seemed more than I could bear, and I thought Miss Dix would never come. At last, she appeared, with Dr. S., who eyed me keenly and, it seemed to me, very savagely, and gave me in charge of an orderly to show me to the surgical ward, as called. It consisted of many small rooms, with a broad corridor, every room so full of cots that it was only barely possible to pass between them. Such a sorrowful sight. The men had just been taken off the battlefield, and some of them had been lying there for 4 days almost without clothing, their wounds never dressed, so dirty and wretched. Someone gave me my charges as to what I was to do. It seemed such a hopeless task to do anything to help them that I wanted to throw myself down and give it up. Miss Dix left me, and soon the doctors came and ordered me to follow them while they examined and dressed the wounds. They seemed to me then, and afterwards I found they were, the most brutal men I saw. They were both volunteers. So, I began my work, I might say night and day. The surgeon told me he had no room for me, and a nurse told me he said he would make the house so hot for me I would not stay long. When I told Miss Dix I could not remain without a room to sleep in, she, knowing the plan of driving out, said, "My child, Mary was nearly as old as herself, you will stay where I have placed you." In the meantime, McClellan's army was being landed below us from the peninsula. Night and day the rumbling of heavy cannon, the marching of soldiers, the groaning of the sick and wounded were constantly heard, and yet in all that time I never once looked from the window, I was so busy with the men. One of the rooms of the ward was the operating room, and the passing in and out of those who were to be operated upon, and the coming and going of surgeons added so much to the general confusion. I doubt if at any time during the war, there was ever such confusion as at this time. The insufficient help, the unable surgeons, and a general want of organization were very distressing, but I was too busy then and too tired for want of proper sleep to half realize it. Though I slept at the bedsides of the men or in a corner of the rooms, I was afraid to complain lest I be discharged. I was horribly ignorant, of course, and could only try to make comfortable, but the staff doctors were very friendly and occasionally helped me, and someone occasionally showed me about bandaging, so by degrees I began to do better. The worst doctor had been discharged, much to my joy, but the other one, despite his drinking habits, stayed on. After the morning visit it was no use calling him for anything, and I had to rely on the officer of the day if I needed help. I know now that many a life could have been saved if there had been a competent surgeon in the ward. At this time, the ward was full of very sick men and sometimes 2 would be dying at the same time, and both begging me to stay with them, so I got little sleep. Moreover, I had no room of my own. Occasionally a nurse would extend the hospitality of the floor in hers, and I would have a straw bed dragged in on which to get a few hours' sleep. This, with hurried bath and fresh clothes, was my only rest for weeks. It was no use to complain. This simply stormed at me and said there was no room, while Miss Dix would say, "You can bear it a while, my child, I have placed you here and you must stay." I was at that time her only nurse in the Mansion House. End of Mary's own words. Later Miss Dix succeeded in getting rid of all the others and replacing them with her own. Mary was renowned for care and high survival rate. Mary later worked at a military hospital in New Bern, North Carolina, where she contracted yellow fever. It also notes her service in the Franco-Prussian War. As a baroness, she wanted to tend to her husband's homeland. Mary and Clara Barton served in the American Civil and the Franco-Prussian Wars. They were both awarded the Cross of Merit for Women and Girls by Kaiser Wilhelm I. That was akin to the Iron Cross. Upon her return from Europe, in January 1874, she was the superintendent of nurses training at the Massachusetts General Hospital. After months it was determined that it was not a good fit for her. The hospital noted her shortcomings as an administrator. Mary also served 2 years as the administrator of the maternity asylum at Staten Island, New York. Later Mary lived in a room at the Grundman Studios in Boston. The building was near the Trinity Church in Copley Square. The building later became the home of the Copley Society. On April 9, 1899, Boston Sunday Globe had a quarter-page story about 30 people who resided at the Grumman Studios. The Boston Globe described it as Boston's home of choice to the bohemian set that included younger artists of rising fame. Sculptors, architects, decorators, and designers, Mary was as the most interesting of the whole artistic group. She was one of the best loved of all. The article noted her service in both wars and having received the Iron Cross. She was described as the Little Madam. Though she is too modest to call herself an artist, she creates embroidery designs. Although she's over 80 years old and has wrinkled as a brown rose petal, her hand and eyes are keen as they were years before. Annie Frances Kendall Freitag. Annie Frances Kendall Freitag was born in Boston on May 4, 1830. She was the daughter of Abel and Mayo Richards Kendall. In 1856, Abel committed suicide by hanging himself in the attic of their Somerset Street home in Boston. A death notice stated that he was depressed and was losing his hearing. A merchant, he left his family in affluent circumstances. On June 7, 1865, she married Frederick Daniel Freitag. His occupation was listed as officer, United States Army. He was born in Germany. His age was listed as 25 and Annie's was 35. They had a son, Frederick E., in Boston on August 25, 1866. He died 2 days later from convulsions. Their only other child, Joseph Kendall Freitag, was born on September 12, 1868, in New York. I located the following, written by Civil War author and historian Ronald S. Coddington. It is from one of his books, Faces of Civil War Nurses, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2020. I highly recommend his books. It is a rare event when a reference to the mental health of a Civil War soldier ends up in primary sources. Today, I found one in the pension file of Annie Frances Kendall Freitag. The soldier to whom she described as suffering from a distressing nervous condition was her husband, Frederick Daniel Freitag. Fred's military service was notable for his 3 wounds. The first, at White Oaks during the 1862 Peninsula Campaign, caused a bullet to be forever lodged in his thigh and imprisonment in Richmond for a month. His other 2 wounds happened weeks apart during the 1864 Overland Campaign, a gunshot in the hand and a shell fragment in the foot. Fred managed to recover from all this and mustered out with his comrades 30th Pennsylvania Infantry in the summer of 1864. He went on to become an officer in the 24th U.S. Colored Infantry and married Annie in June 1865. Annie, who had served as a nurse and first met Fred as he recuperated from his White Oak Swamp wounding at a U.S. military hospital in Chester, Pennsylvania. They marveled at his physical strength in light of his injuries. Everything changed in 1886 after Fred suffered a breakdown. A physician diagnosed him with consumption and suffering from what Annie noted was a distressing nervous condition, perhaps post-traumatic stress disorder. She attributed his health issues to his war wounds and added, he passed away after 2 years of extreme suffering and utter dependence and disability. Fred was 48 years old. I located Frederick's grave at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. I added a memorial to findagrave.com and requested a picture of his murder. They shall place a flag on his grave on every Memorial Day. Mary Sullivan Felton. Mary Sullivan Felton was born on April 30, 1839, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She died April 29, 1896, in Boston, from pneumonia and pericarditis. Her father, Cornelius Conway Felton, died in 1862 at age 57. Mary is buried with him. He had been the president of Harvard College. I located the following thesis that established her as a nurse in the Civil War. Mary and several other nurses, including Louisa May Alcott and Abby Lowe, challenged the doctors as to their poor treatment of the sick and wounded soldiers. These women had the connections to plead their case at the highest level. Please note the mention of Mary Finney von Olnhausen and Anna Lowell Woodbury. They are buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery and included in this series. These words came from Caitlin Ruth Vance's 2017 master's thesis at the University of New Hampshire, Durham. The nurses kept a close watch over their patients, and their letters home reveal their protective feelings toward the men in their care, which made hospital inefficiencies even more appalling. While working at the Armory Square Hospital, Lowe wrote, "I begin to feel impatient. There are 2 of our patients who it seems ought to be doing well, and yet I hear they are low." Lowe blamed their lack of recovery on the surgeon, observing, "Dr. Bauer has charge of the ward and he is a careless, miserable quack." Inexperienced doctors could have devastating effects on the soldiers' lives and their recovery. This is particularly evident in a case at the Armory Hospital. In the spring of 1863, the hospital received a new surgeon in charge because Dr. Willard Bliss had been arrested based on the comment of a disgruntled steward who had been dismissed by Bliss. The nurses initially appeared to like the new surgeon in charge, describing him as exceedingly pleasant and gentlemanly. Yet, as the women watched him practice, they became concerned about his lack of professional experience. Lowe wrote, "We like him very much indeed, but he is far too young to have charge of this large surgical hospital, where the worst cases are left." The women's fears were validated in the case of a soldier who suffered a hemorrhaged artery in his leg. The wound had ruptured and began to mortify, causing doctors to order an amputation of the leg in an attempt to save the patient. There was consensus among the ward surgeons. However, the surgeon in charge delayed the surgery in the hopes that both the patient and the leg could be saved. When the ruptured a second time, the surgery occurred, but, for hours after the operation, the soldier died, having never recovered from the effect of the chloroform. Word spread that it was the first operation of its kind conducted by the new surgeon in charge. Despite a consensus that the soldier would have died regardless of the circumstances, the incident had the nurses' belief that the new surgeon was too inexperienced. According to them, the surgeon showed such a want of experience and they were determined to remedy the situation for the sake of their current and future patients. Nurses Anna Lowell and Mary Felton left the hospital and spoke with Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, imploring him to speak with President Abraham Lincoln. They asked that Dr. Bliss be allowed to return to the Armory Square Hospital prior to his scheduled trial, arguing that the lives of the patients were at stake. Dr. Bliss was then allowed to return to the Army Square Hospital. In her memoir, Mary Finney reflected on the impact of inexperienced physicians, now that many a life could have been saved if there had been a competent surgeon in the ward. Inexperience led to botched surgical procedures as well as inefficiencies in hospital administration. Since nurses were a constant presence among the hospital wards, they witnessed the daily experiences of the soldiers in their care. Common concerns expressed by the nurses focused on the atmosphere of the hospital, the lack of nourishment for the soldiers, and the treatment of the patients by the medical staff. In January 1863, just a few days before falling dangerously ill with typhoid fever, Louisa May Alcott wrote in her diary, "A more perfect pestilence box than this house I never saw. Old, damp, dirty, full of vile odors from wounds, kitchens, washrooms, and stables. No competent head, male or female, to right matters, and a jumble of good, bad, and indifferent nurses, surgeons, and attendants to complicate the chaos still more." Nurses argued that the priorities of the medical admission were misplaced. They observed that as much, if not more, attention was given to the appearance of the hospitals than to the care of the sick and wounded. Mary Felton, of Cambridge, Massachusetts, served for a long time with her friend, Miss Anna Lowell Woodbury, at Armory Square Hospital, Washington. Source: Women's Work in the Civil War: A Record of Heroism, Patriotism, and Patience, 1867. Authors L.P. Brockett and Mrs. Mary C. Vaughan. That free 867-page book can be downloaded from Google Book. Mary McKinnon was born in Argyll, Nova Scotia, on February 11, 1829. Her father was Colin McKinnon and her mother, Rhoda Kenny McKinnon. On April 2, 1858, she married James C. Tate in Charlestown. It was Mary's first marriage and James' second. He was 29, and he 33. On June 12, 1853, James married Alice J. Hicks of Charlestown. Alice, and her stillborn son, James C. Tate, died on April 9, 1856. They are buried in Boston's Old Burial Ground. Her death record indicates on January 29, 1863, Mary Tate, age 33, died at Douglas Army Hospital, Washington, D.C. Her occupation was noted nurse in USA. Her burial record at Mount Auburn Cemetery, Cambridge, notes that on February 2, 1863, Mary was buried at Matthews Public Lot. That cemetery record also notes her death at Douglas Hospital in Washington, D.C., from diphtheria. The poet, Walt Whitman, worked at this hospital. On December 1, 1862, Mary Tate of Charlestown executed her last will and testament. She left her estate to her husband James C. Tate. On July 31, 1861, Mary's husband James, his brother Moses F., and Moses's son John M., enlisted for 3 years in the 2nd Battery, Massachusetts Light Artillery. That unit had just been organized. They had worked tanning. James and Moses were Morocco dressers and John was a tanner. They also used the last name of Adrian. The unit went to Baltimore in August 1861, and served throughout the South. James and John mustered out on August 16, 1864. That was the end of their 3-year enlistment. The unit had very light casualties as they lost 30 enlisted men, 4 by combat and 26 by disease. One of those casualties was James' brother Moses. He died August 8, 1862, at New Orleans, from dysentery. His body was returned the following year and buried at Boston Burial Ground. James died on April 13, 1865, from lung fever. The history of his unit notes that several members died from illness following their discharge. In modern days that would be a service-connected death. James is buried next to Mary, and like Mary, his grave was not marked. I expect that Mary followed her husband James to the war. The following is Mrs. Tate's obituary, published on February 6, 1863, by Salem Gazette, Salem, Massachusetts. We have to announce the decease of Mrs. Mary Tate of Charlestown, which sad event occurred at Douglas Hospital, Washington, a few days since. Mrs. Tate, at the call of humanity, left a comfortable home and gave comfort, health, and her life to lessen sufferings of our soldiers. At home, she maintained the life of a Christian, modest, active, and always where duty required her to be. Her kind and useful services in the hospitals, attended as they were by that pure sympathy which flowed so readily from her warm heart, won for her many grateful thanks from the sick, wounded and dying soldiers she administered in their need. I attempted to have government markers placed on their lots that recognize their Civil War service. I was successful with James, however, even though Mary died on active duty. A request for a marker was denied by the Veterans Administration. Their reason for the denial is that women's military service was not recognized until the early 1900s. I have requested 2 members of Congress to intercede as a question of equity. Harriet Ann Jacobs was born into slavery on February 11, 1813, in Edenton, North Carolina. She died on March 7, 1897, in Washington, D.C. Raised in Edenton, North Carolina, Harriet and her brother, John Jacobs, were born to Delilah Horniblow and Elijah, a carpenter. Harriet recalled a happy early childhood. In her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, available as a free download on Google Books, she noted, "We lived together in a comfortable home, and though we were all slaves, I was so fondly shielded that I never dreamed I was a piece of merchandise. After Delilah Horniblow's death, Harriet and John went to live with Delilah's enslaver Margaret Horniblow. Harriet was only 6 at the time. Though it was illegal to do so, Margaret Horniblow taught her how to read and write. Harriet wrote, "For this privilege, which so rarely falls to the lot of a slave, I bless Margaret's memory." 6 years later, Harriet and John's father, Elijah, died and was interred next to Delilah in a place known as Providence. Blacks in Edenton had purchased this tract of land communally and established a meeting house and graveyard there. For African Americans in the area, Providence represented their crowning effort to create space. Scholar Jean Fagan Yellen writes in Harriet Jacobs, A Life 2004, available at most libraries. That same year Margaret Horniblow passed away, and the ownership of Harriet and John were transferred to Horniblow's 3-year-old niece, Mary Matilda Norcom. But it was the child's parents, Dr. Jane and Mary Norcom, who held ultimate power over the 2 siblings. Dr. Norcom was a wealthy owner of a large plantation, and in his household, Harriet met the harsh indignities of slavery as he began a relentless campaign of sexual harassment. Harriet wrote in her book, "My master began to whisper foul words in my ear. I turned from him with disgust and hatred. But he was my master." Dr. Norcom denied Harriet's request to marry a free black man. In an effort to ward off his advances, she started an affair with Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. A white man, Sawyer came from a family of colonial aristocracy, law in North Carolina. She gave birth to a son Joseph and daughter, Louisa, by Sawyer. She hoped Norcom would revenge himself by selling her. Eventually, Harriet escaped to the house of her grandmother, where she sought refuge for 7 years. Cramped in a tiny crawlspace 9 feet long and 6 feet wide, unable to stand, she endured the stifling heat of the summer and the bitter cold of the winter. With the light from a small hole, she passed the time sewing, writing, and reading, gaining a self-taught education that would soon serve her well. Sawyer was eventually able to buy John, Louisa, and Joseph, and arranged for them to live with its grandmother. Only through the small hole could Harriet gaze upon her beloved children. When Sawyer later moved to Washington to serve in Congress, John accompanied him, and in 1838, during a family trip to New York City, he escaped north. In Rochester, New York, he worked in the anti-slavery office and room and lectured widely throughout New York and Massachusetts. Sawyer arranged for Louisa Jacobs to live in Brooklyn, New York. In 1842, Harriet's family planned her route north and she was eventually reunited with her daughter. Later they moved to Boston, where Joseph also joined the family. Harriet finally felt as if I was beyond the reach of the bloodhounds, and for the first time during many years, I had my children together with me. Much is known about Harriet's involvement in the freedmen's movement, during, and after, the Civil War. Although Harriet is not listed on the rolls as a Civil War nurse, I believe that the following articles note her to be a Civil War nurse. In fact, she did double duty of nursing African American soldiers, as well as escaped slaves. The April 10, 1863, issue of The Liberator, published a full-column letter from Harriet. "The white men of the North have helped us thus far, and we want to help them. I'd like to fight for them if they would only treat us like men. The colored people could not do enough for the first regiments that came here. They had entire faith in them as the deliverers of their race. The sight of the U.S. uniform took all the fear out of their hearts and inspired them with hope and confidence. Many of them freely fed the soldiers at their own meals and lodged them as comfortably as possible in their humble dwellings. In return for their kindness and ever-ready service, they often receive insults and sometimes beatings, and so they have learned to distrust those who wear the uniform of the U.S. You know how warmly I have sympathized with the Northern Army, all the more does it grieve me to see many of them for the principles of freedom. But I am proud and happy to know that the black man is to strike a blow for liberty. I am rejoiced that Colonel Shaw heads the Massachusetts Regiment, for I know he has a noble heart." In the January 13, 1863, edition of The Liberator, Harriet wrote, "We have between 800 and 900 sick colored soldiers, and more are expected daily. All colored soldiers are well quartered, the medical attendance is good, but you know very sick men cannot eat hospital rations. And when they look up and say, I have not eaten anything for 2 or 3 days, could you bring me a little of so and so? I think I could eat it. You wish by magic your purse would lengthen, so you could give each poor boy what he craves. Their condition at least has a bit little sunshine in it, languishing and dying away from home and all they hold dear, buried among strangers, who neither sigh nor weep as the piles of earth fall on their coffin. Yesterday, I visited some men who were brought in several days ago. Nearly every one was suffering from lung disease. Such fearful coughing, I have never heard. It cost something to die for freedom. North Carolina Nursing History, Appalachian State University, noted that she escaped to the North and joined the abolitionist cause. During the Civil War, Jacobs nursed in Alexandria, Virginia for the Union Army and for the newly freed slaves living in the area. Certain writings were also taken from M.R. Cordell, author of Courageous Women of the Civil War, Soldiers, Spies, Medics, and More. It is noted on Part 3, notes her as a young nurse, First South, Harriet and Jacobs, she did her own thinking. $100 reward will be given for the apprehension and delivery of my servant girl Harriet. She is a light mulatto 21 years of age, 5 feet, 4 inches high, of thick and corpulent habit, having on her head a thick covering black hair that curls naturally, but which can be easily combed straight. She speaks easily and fluently and has an agreeable carriage and address. Being a good seamstress, she has been accustomed to dress well. Has a variety of very fine clothes, made in the prevailing fashion, and will probably appear, if abroad, tricked out in gay and fashionable finery. As this girl upside absconded from the possession of my son without cause or provocation, it is probable she designs to transport herself to the North. The above reward, with all reasonable charges, will be given for apprehending her or securing her in any prison, or jail, within the United States. All persons are hereby forewarned against harboring or entertaining her in any way instrumental in her escape, under the most rigorous penalties of the law. James Norcom, Edenton, North Carolina, June 30.